And now I turn to Professor Rama, who would be speaking on, a component of the budget which has been most widely publicized. So let's try to be wiser on that. Professor Rama.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nityanand, Dr. Muchkund, Dubey, and CSD for inviting me to speak. The advantage I have is I have very closely listened to all the speakers in the morning, and I'm going to just focus on health, but in the overall context of the remarks made on the budget. Firstly, I want to say, yes, as Mr. Dubey said, there's a lot of hype around the increase on health, but I think there are many smoke screens which I will try to sort of address as we look through what is actually happening in the health sector. With the COVID pandemic, I think we faced a huge humanitarian crisis. We faced a huge healthcare crisis. It was very clear through the COVID pandemic that it was the public sector's responsibility to take care of all the needs. The private sector basically absolved itself of any responsibility, and the government did not really act to either nationalize private sector during the pandemic. So you had a weak public sector which responded, in my view, quite admirably, especially client health workers, and with adequate protective measures. We know all those stories. So in that context, you would have expected that, and this is a global issue that is being raised, that the public sector investment is absolutely critical in future, not just about the pandemic, that the pandemic actually showed us the fault lines, and this could have been addressed through a very robust investment in the health services. Now, 137%, as Praveen and even Biswajit Dhar had mentioned earlier, to me is a smoke screen, because it is actually bringing in water supply, sanitation, and health services into one big pool. And in that, there are many different funding sources that are being brought in to show this, what is a very dramatic increase. If you only look at health services, and this was again commented by many commentators on the budget, it's only 11% increase. And if you take in inflation of, say, about 6%, in real terms, you're really talking about a 5% increase. The important point that Praveen made, which I think is very important, especially when it comes to health, is the opacity of the budget, because you are sort of conflating a whole lot of sources of funding, and we are not quite sure from the budget figures what is coming from where. I also want to say what Dr. Govinda said was very, very important, because the nutrition budget should also be seen in relation to the health budget. So because we know that stunting in children is still very high, nutrition support for children and mothers through the ICDS is very critical. But the point that he makes is that with this merging of Poshan Abhiyan and ICDS, you actually see a slashing of funds. So these are the smoke screens I'm alluding to, because I think when you say, oh, fantastic, we've done 137%, and we can be applauded for that, I'm sorry, we cannot be applauded. I also see this budget in a longitudinal sense, because I think the budget itself to me is quite insignificant. What we need to see is that the efforts for the pre-budget in the last 1 year has been towards more privatization of health services. If you look at the 15th Finance Commission recommendations, if you look at it in relation to the Niti Aayog's proposal for the health sector, and if you look at the kind of the high-level group that was set up by the PMO for health, they are all moving towards greater privatization. They are talking about public-private partnerships in the health sector. Now, in all of this 11% increase is for the health and wellness centers. It is for setting up labs. Now, I will come to that a little later, But what is important for us to understand is the health and wellness center investments are necessary for the project of public-private partnerships. I'll give you one example. The Niti Aayog subcommittee on medical education has made it very clear that they're going to privatize medical education. They're going to elicit private finance into medical education. But the private medical colleges require hospitals for training of their doctors. And what they are proposing is that district hospitals will partner with private medical colleges to provide a public-private partnership, and the private medical college will actually redefine the role of the district hospital. So, I mean, if those of you are interested, that document is very, very important. So this is one. The other is a lot of the curative services are being talked about in a PPP mode. The 11% increase, minus the inflation, etc. What is going to happen to employment, increased employment and secure employment for our health workers? If you look at in most states today, it is all contracted out. Doctors contracting in. So the doctors, the health workers, the ASHAs, everybody is being pretty much in a contract mode. So with the 11% increase, you're not going to be able to really build the human resources in health in any significant manner. The other very interesting aspect of this budget, again another smokescreen, is that the government of India has already gone in for loan negotiations with three very important international bodies. One is the ADB, the second is the World Bank, and the third is the Gates Foundation. And if you look at all the loan agreements for these, this happened in the 2020, from July onwards. They are all addressing strengthening urban health systems, strengthening preventive care, and strengthening the setting up of these laboratories, the public health laboratories, the surveillance. So it's very interesting. The statement from the budget speech of the finance minister is actually a direct quote from the World Bank document on what are the areas that require strengthening. So to me, this is another smokescreen in the sense that we are, as a continuation of the 1991, let's not forget 1991, we are actually moving into the health sector with a loan financing system. So, this the actual spending of the government on the health sector becomes more and more questionable. The other very important aspect, which I do believe is important, is that the private sector, both the drug industry as well as the hospital industry, has been pushing the government for subsidies for themselves, but more importantly, that they want a very strong public sector infrastructure, so which they can use when they feel that their resources are dwindling or their profit margins are falling. So I find that this really, the budget is to me a very clear departure in another stage, taking privatization to the level. It requires the health and wellness investments, because for all preventive care, no private sector is going to come to do that. If you want to ensure mass vaccination of your population, no private sector, the private sector will come in at a cost where people will have to pay. But the actual mass vaccination programs will have to be done by your frontline workers in the public sector. So it's all the areas where the private sector will not be willing to come in are being now invested in. But that investment is not only the government investment, and that is the point I want to make. The other very important aspect of this budget is the increased water supply and sanitation. And if you look at the water supply and sanitation, it has right from the beginning, including the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, has been an avenue for private investment to come in. The public sector it's not as if you're building a comprehensive system of waste management and other things, but you're opening up for technology to come in. Now, this is another very important area where the government is soliciting public-private partnership, both in health and in allied areas, which is the use of technology to come in. So whether it's telemedicine or it is bringing in technologies to clean up your environment or to do other things, you're really opening up spaces for not only national, domestic private capital, but you're actually opening up to global private capital. And I think these are the kinds of trends that I see and the many smoke screens that exist in this process. Now, for example, let's take the development of our vaccine. You have, and sorry, one last thing is that this whole scheme is being called Atmanirbhar Swasthya, PM's Atmanirbhar Swasthya Yojana. The Atmanirbhar is not about more of public sector or more of public investment, but that Atmanirbhar is to facilitate the greater privatization, which has already been designed for over the last 2 years. So, in a sense, to me, the COVID pandemic has not touched the government in any moral or in an ethical way. It has not really addressed the needs of the health sector adequately. There is great opacity in the budget figures, and therefore I think the budget figure are not the important things. I think we need to look at the trends that have emerged, the ways in which the government has responded. And I think one of the earlier speakers had mentioned the budget exercise itself, in that sense, does not have the same importance that it used to have in earlier times. And it's really a tragedy that the nutrition budget has been dealt with in the way it has. So I'll stop here. I know we have sort of exceeded our time. And if there are any specific questions, I'm happy to take it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We were planning to have at least half an hour for question and comments, but we don't have the time. But I would still try to, with your permission, extend it for at least 15 minutes. So, and then I would request the people who are going to ask questions to confine themselves to asking questions. And at this stage, not to make comments of their own. We would very much like to hear all of you, but you know the time constraints. So now, anyone who would like to ask questions from the floor?
I want to ask something.
Yes, Sushmita.
Yes, Sushmita, go ahead.
So, recognizing that this is a really difficult time, I look forward to some solutions or suggestions from the speakers, like what could have been done in this difficult situation so that things would be better.
And I would also like to make an intervention. It's not a question. I mean, till last year, Professor K.B. Saxena used to speak on social sector development schemes and budget. He's not, he didn't join us today. It has been quite well established, Professor Praveen Jha, because he works on budget, but he knows. I mean, for last 15-16 years, this SCAP, Schedule Caste subplan and tribal subplan, they have never been allocated money in proportion to what they should have obtained. And the trend has continued in this budget also. In fact, the Honorable FM didn't even mention these SCP and TSP in her plan. And interestingly, one very important scheme pertaining to post-metric fellowship to SCs and ST students, the scheme has been grappling with low or inadequate budgetary allocations for past many years, and allocations haven't been increased yet. And in a very characteristic fashion, they have allocated 35,000 crore rupees for a period of next 4 years. I mean, in union budgets, we used to read allocations for one financial year. They have allocated it for next 4 years without mentioning how will that money be spent. And the most important issue pertaining to MoMA, this Ministry of Minority Affairs as well as Ministry of Tribal Affairs, is non-spending of the money that has been allocated to these departments and ministries. And if you see the actuals that have been released for the year 2018-19, the trend has been continued. So, the previous governments as well as this government for past 6 years, they don't look serious for any efforts to bridge the development gap between SC/STs and other general social groups. This is all.
Now, I think that relating to Sushmita's question, in the overall context, what should have really been done is to, make provisions for demand stimulation. And I would request Biswajit to elaborate it a little bit, and if necessary, then Professor Dhar.
Yes, I think we have to see what could have been done, and in my intervention, I tried to focus on some of these points, because all the colleagues in the panel have mentioned about how expenditure has been slashed in extremely critical areas, right from education, health, agriculture, you name it. I think, there has been a slashing of expenditure by the government. So that's why I was actually mentioning, I didn't want to elaborate, because I knew our colleagues are going to be mentioning about, giving the details, that, all this hoopla about the government spending and everyone looking at the fiscal deficit to say that, there has been a big push by the government. This sounds absolutely ridiculous, to say the very least, because what the government has actually done is that, it has frittered away resources to areas or to in areas where it is absolutely not desirable. It has actually not garnered resources from where it should have actually done this. And at the end of the day, we are having a situation where, sectors which are absolutely imperative for focused attention, is if this country this economy has to go anywhere forward out of this pandemic, those have been completely left to the mercy of, I think cronies. Now that is something that has to be highlighted here. Now I was, in the pre-budget, and I was actually doing an exercise. I was looking at 4 budgets, earlier budgets, which were presented after either a war, a conflict situation, or an economic downturn. And then started with the 58-59 budget of Pandit Nehru, which was after the economic crisis that the country faced. The 63-64 budget of Morarji Desai, 73-74 budget of Y.V. Chauhan, and 91-92 budget of Manmohan Singh. Now, in each of the budgets, and it was absolutely striking, that all these budgets actually targeted either luxury consumer goods or those sections of the society who need to be taxed, and it had brought in that dimension. Now, it's incredible that this exercise, this entire budgetary exercise, instead of taxing those who should be, is actually giving concessions to those who don't deserve it at all. So I think this is the hallmark of the budget. And I think several speakers, Professor Haque, Professor Govinda, and also Rama, they mentioned this, that the objective function is really to hand over resources of the state to the cronies, and this is the budget making exercise all about. And this is what we have seen. So, it's difficult to say how you can fix a problem where the government is not intending to go in that direction. So it's like that proverbial saying that you can wake up a person who's actually sleeping, but the person who's actually pretending to sleep, how do you wake that person up? So the frustration today is that you have a government which is just not interested in going down the path that all of us are wanting the government to move. It wants to move in a completely different direction. So the task before us becomes even more difficult. So Praveen wanted to say something.
Praveen.
Sir, you have to unmute your mic.
Yes. It's okay, Nona? Okay. Just 2-3 points. The first obvious thing, this is in response to what Sushmita asked, is to acknowledge the problem. There is a problem, but as Professor Dhar said just now, if you want to be an ostrich, fine. I mean, what can be done? Now, the Financial Times of London, which is supposed to be one of the most, iconic spokesperson for right-wing economics, that said in early August that we have to change the way of doing what needs to be done in the context of the pandemic and so on, and talks of a lot of public sector investments, lot of things which generally economists associated with the left of center, highlight. That is, all of you should, those of you who are not familiar with it, should look at that FT editorial of early August. Right? So there is a hell of a lot that we know what needs to be done. Right? None of that was done. If anything, even this claim of additional expenditure, as I mentioned, is a definitional jugglery. Do you really think that the entire nation is a bunch of fools? They can't figure out what very basics are. Yeah. So what needed to be done, as has been emphasized repeatedly, is to step up all those processes, expenditures, etc., which revive demand, number one. Number two, to do all that, then you need resources. Yeah. And again, I think I follow in the footsteps of Biswajit on this completely, that unusual times require, maybe unusual interventions. Even if you are steeped in this broader neoliberal orthodoxy and so on, at least acknowledge that this is a very difficult time and do some things. I'll give you only one example, and several countries have done this. Yeah, Argentina has several countries. Let me not, for lack of time, I will not get into the details. Can we think of at least a solidarity tax on those who can afford it? At least for 1 year, at least for 2-3 years. As per 2019 estimate, in India, the total wealth of the dollar billionaires is about 560 lakh crores. Think of 1% tax on their wealth, 5.6 lakh crores. If we assume that this wealth is being inherited, passing on generation to generation and so on, think of some percentage, 25, 30, whatever percent is appropriate for inheritance tax, something in the neighborhood of, let's say, your corporate tax or whatever, right? We are looking at a fabulous figure of 10, 12, 15 lakh crores. Why not? So, Susmita and other young friends, it is important for us to recognize two things. That there is just no way. Given the kind of trap that this government is in terms of its thinking, its friendship with certain kinds of, people, so to say, that is out. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
There is one question in the chat box for Professor Rama Baru. Madam, I think you have read the question. Would you like to respond to it?
This is this center state. I have replied on. We've been having a chat in the chat box. So,
okay.
There are two. I just want to highlight two more important issues as far as health is concerned. You see, there has been a gradual centralization of certain health schemes, and these have become very important populist programs and are being used in their elections, state elections. So, whether it's the Ayushman Bharat or many of the other cash transfer schemes that have been put in place for health, it's for hospitalization, etc. It has a certain populism which it creates, and people actually feel. And this has been one of the important departures in the welfare sector as far as this government is concerned, that this plethora of populist programming and the depth and the height of which we cannot really understand, and how it actually in terms of governance spans out at the state level, is a very important issue. And if you look at the Finance Commission, if you look at it in relation to what the economic survey says, and you look at the budget, they're all out of sync. Because the 15th Finance Commission actually, says that you need to finance health much more. And the analysis done in the economic survey is actually a good analysis. But in the translation, so, somebody I think in the morning said, so will his job be on the line? Because, clearly... You said it, Praveen. I think it's particularly exemplified in the case of health, right? So I'm just saying that really the center state issue is very important. To what extent does this government actually respect federalism? You saw the whole GST issue also, and that the states, as far as health is concerned, are actually in the red because they have battled the COVID pandemic with limited resources, and they are finding other ways to finance, So I think this is a very, very important issue.
I think there is one more question in the chat box. It is by Professor Vivek, I think Vivek Kumar. Professor Jha may like to respond to it. And the question is about, he is making a point that we all are talking about budget allocations that have been made in this union budget, but there has been a very little discussion on actual budgeting or actual expenditure. And the figures that have been released recently, they show a very deplorable picture. That is, the actual expenditure has been very low than what was allocated last year in the union budget. So, Professor Jha, if you would like to respond to this.
You see, I think I'll respond very briefly because we have really run out of time. Two things need to be noted. In general, the quality of expenditure, etc., is one very important concern. So you should not be looking only at the quantity. Number two, as it happens, for last several years, actual is more than the revised, which is more than the budget estimate is more than the revised, and then the revised is more than the actual expenditure. That always happens. Now, this time what has happened is essentially in some segments, some pockets, in fact, the revised was more than the budgeted. That we need to acknowledge. For instance, as has already been mentioned, Narega and so on and so forth. So yes, so it was unusual, and in that sense, but yes, we need to examine these estimates much more carefully, both for quantity and quality. Thank you.
Thank you. So we conclude now. I think we have now reached the outer limit of the time that we set. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us and giving such a well-studied and detailed presentation in each area. A very, very enriching discussion, and we will try to bring out something within a couple of days. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you
very much, sir.
Roping in this conversation, all of us. Thank you. It was lovely conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Should we close the meeting, sir?
I think yes, because I think that we have in our part Satyanarayan Katha, where we invoke the gods to come, and then at the end there's a sentence that Sarve Devas Swasthanam Gacha. all the gods, you go back to your own place. Thank you.
No, this time the gods are there in their places, sir. We don't have to go. We are just here.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.